Hey everybody, my name's Gary and joined by my friend Luther over here. And we wanted to have a conversation this morning. Admittedly, we both watched the Be the Bridge, Stephen Furtick, Pastor John Gray interview. So there's probably a little bit of mimicking of that here, but truth be told, we had our own conversation
prior to
that, and just, you know, after when we got to kind of the end of our initial conversation, we both really felt like, man, we could share this. So I don't know if you want to just talk a little about who you are and how we know each other.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Luther Wade. I'm currently the youth pastor over at Shiloh Baptist Church. I've been in that position since 2007. While serving as a youth pastor, that gave me the occasion to meet Gary, who was no, not poor guy, who was a youth pastor at the time. Was a youth pastor here at Garden Bible Chapel at the time as well. We had some cross-bridge fellowships that gave us the opportunity to meet. I used to meet with him, you know, once a month over at the Cornerstone when it was over there in the Groton Plaza. And so our friendship just kind of grew from there. From there, we would talk to each other, not just at the meetings, but we formed a friendship from there. So we have nearly a 20-year friendship that will allow this conversation to be both effective and meaningful. I was excited when he reached out to me because I felt like he was genuine in his wanting to reach out. It wasn't him trying to absolve himself of any white guilt. It was just a friend reaching out to a friend in these troubled times we find ourselves living in.
Yeah, it's well said. You know, we I was trying to think back historically to I know what I was going to say. When we bought our house, you might have been the first or one of the first to come visit us in our new house. I mean,
you told me that.
You know, still unsettled.
And it was still under construction.
Yeah, we would occasionally, you know, get together and always said like, all right, it's not going to be 4 or 6 months before we get together again. But that just kept happening. So, but anyway, in, I guess it was October or late September of 2014. I think is when we bought our house. We spent some time together. But yeah, when this whole thing came up, when George Floyd was killed. Probably 4 or 5 days after, as I was just internally processing, and you know, in the situation we find ourselves in, you're processing for you, but you're also thinking about the people you lead. And I just reached out, sent Luther a text, and just said, brother, I need some fellowship with you. I want to learn from you. And so I think in the spirit of that conversation, maybe just asking you some questions, some repeats of our previous conversation, but just, does that work for you?
Yeah.
So I think the first question I asked, or some form of that, was, you know, I'm listening, I'm hearing all that's going on in the media, and it was before it really became polarized and politicized, but, you know, basically help me understand, and what do I need to learn? As a leader in the white community, in a church that's predominantly white, how do I lead? What do we need to hear? And then sort of tied to that, where we naturally ended up going, the next question was, how has this affected you personally, and what and your own history in terms of racism in our country and in our area? So the floor is yours, my friend.
Yeah, so you know, this is not new for Black people. You know, we've been dealing with this our entire existence here in this country. You know, my story is my grandfather's story, is my dad's story, and my great-grandfather's story, my great-great-grandfather's story. It has just taken on different forms over the last 400 years. And so this, you know, the things that we're feeling in response to what happened to George Floyd are not different feelings. We've been feeling this for a very long time. And, you know, what really struck me, you know, I've been in and out of anger, you know, throughout this entire time, because there comes a point in time in everyone's life when you're dealing with certain things that you just become sick and tired of being sick and tired. And, you know, so, I guess one of the real inflection points in this particular issue was I watched my son have a conversation on Instagram Live with some of his college friends. And listening at my nearly 20-year-old son recount the various contexts of information, of racism that he's felt in his life, at just 20 years old, and realizing that his life, the first 20 years of his life was no different from the first 20 years of my life, it gave me another layer of anger, because now my son, who I have tried to pass on a better world than the world that I got, is experiencing many of the same things that I experienced. And one of the things that I really grabbed hold to, and when I spoke with Gary, is there is a different context that Black parents always look at these issues from than our white counterparts. And one of the things that I've wished, when these things have happened in the past, is I wish that versus becoming defensive, that my white friends would do what Gary did, would call me and ask me how I feel, versus telling me how I should feel, or listening to how I feel and telling me why it's not as bad as I say it is. In other words, listen to me to understand versus listen to me to respond. And I feel like so often when we speak with one another, while the other is talking, we are forming a response to what they're saying versus actually listening to what they're saying. And so, again, one of the things that I ask for, any person listening to this is when Gary called me, when he reached out to me, Gary had a nearly 20-year friendship to leverage. Don't, approach a Black person that you have no relationship with about this. It's insulting. If you want to have these conversations, then you have this conversation with somebody you already have a relationship with, because that way that person knows, I know Gary's heart. And so it's totally different talking to you versus, what young people call a rando. And so in the spirit of that, and I know as we talk, as this conversation it develops, there are some important things that we need to talk about as fellow Christians. Yeah. How are we going to deal with this as a church universal versus the Black church or the white church? It's time that the church deal with this wholly, not partly.
So let me ask you a question then, because you brought up a really important point. One of the things I've been really grateful for, and I don't know if I've verbalized this to you or not, or let me say it this way, I feel really bad for the white leader in the community, or more especially in the church, who has to go, man, there's something here I need to understand. I need to get, I was going to say Yellow Pages, but that's a really dated, I need to get on my phone and find a Black minister in town and get to know him. I didn't have to do that. Right? Not only yourself, you're my peer, but I had some mentors like Pastor Joe Coleman and others that I just immediately knew I got to text them and find out. So 2 questions. Tell these folks listening what you said about when this all went down and texting me versus me texting you. And then what would you say to the white leader who doesn't have any Black friends in ministry? Where do they start? What would you recommend?
Okay, so the first thing is, in regards to that first question, I was not going to text you. You was going to have to text me first. Because as the person who has dealt with this his entire life, if you are truly my friend, truly somebody who cares about me, and you see how this issue is impacting, Black people you don't know, because but you see them on TV, and knowing that I'm Black is, I'm obviously a Black man myself. If you are genuinely concerned about my well-being, I don't have to reach out to you. You will reach out to me. And the one one of the parallels I would like to draw to kind of bring that point home to people so that they truly understand. If your child is away in college at UConn, and you hear that there was a disturbance at UConn, that there was some kids that were shot, are you going to wait for your child to call you, or are you going to call your child to make sure your child is okay? Yeah. No, you're going to call your child to make sure your child is okay. And so, again, back to, what we're talking about now, you see that there is unrest and that Black people are really hurting. And on that same token, if you care about me, you're going to reach out to me, and I'm not going to have to reach out to you. So that's the first, that's dealing with that first question. Now, what was your...
What would you say to the Black...
Okay, yeah, I remember now.
Yeah.
And so if you are the white Christian that don't have any Black friends in your electronic Rolodex, then I'm sure there's somebody in your circle that does. Mm-hmm. And you ask them to be an emissary and, witness a conversation versus trying to start one yourself. Yeah. Because again, it's offensive. Or, you have a Black coworker, who you may not be friends with, but you have a relationship with, and leverage that. Or if you're not even comfortable in a person to person, or you may think that this person you may think you want to reach out to is interested in a person to person. Do something, go to your boss, go to the supervisor, go to the manager and say, we really need to deal with this issue. We need to stop acting like this issue isn't an issue. Mm-hmm. And I want to just give out a disclaimer real quick. Although I'm a Black person, I don't speak for all Black people. Mm-hmm. I just need to make that, that point clear. We're not monolithic, we have different voices and different views on things. And so I'm not speaking for all Black people, but I do feel like that I do have shared experience. There's some shared experience there. So that's the advice I would give. Like I said, don't, the one thing you cannot do is try to approach someone you have no relationship with and then ask them, how does that make you feel? You know what I mean? It's not cool.
So I just want to check our camera real quick, and then that's really good. And it's still rolling. All right. That's really good. I want to ask a follow-up question. Well, actually, I want to tell you a couple of things, and that'll steer you into I know you'll have a comment. So you just said you don't speak for all Black people, and the people, any particular ethnic group, because we're on actually a different race. We'll get into that later.
Yeah.
Is not monolithic. But I will tell you, I have talked to 4 ministers in at least the length of our previous conversation. 2 are Hispanic, 2 are Black, and I've talked to a white pastor who is a police chaplain, and then a couple of just friends in this church community or other parts of the country who are African American. Everything that they have said, with maybe some subtle, nuances in their own life, is consistent with what our conversation was. Mm-hmm. So I agree. You don't speak for the entire Black community, but I think the threads are similar. And here's my point. I have the neighbors who live behind me actually built the house that I live in. They're in their 80s, a Black couple. Mm-hmm. And we've become friends over the years. I mean, we became friends the day we moved in. I walked across the street and met them. And we got to talking. She is very sweet, very kind. And we got to talking about this issue the other day. Kind of similar. I just walked across the yard and just saying, hey, how are you going, guys? They've raised their grandchildren. They have 2 grandsons who are both in the military and have recently left. So they're sort of back to an empty nest. And they're amazing people. And actually the husband, he and I are sort of cut from the same cloth. We both are always working on projects, and it's always comparing what we're working on. But we had a long conversation, very similar threads of experiences she's had, her children had, her grandsons have had, concerns she has about her grandsons now being out in the world in the military as young Black men. And we got to the end of that conversation, and I just said, I'm just so glad that we're neighbors and we already have a previous relationship. Mm-hmm. It hasn't been based on our skin. I mean, we're just friends. And that got challenged. My neighbor, her husband, challenged me early on in our relationship with something that was subtle. Now, from my point, it wasn't intended, nor was my heart racist at all. And I don't even necessarily think he meant. Well, let me tell you what happened. So when I would see him and he'd come over and we'd compare a project, I always say, hey, neighbor, right? I always call him neighbor. And he looks at me one day and he goes, why do you always call me neighbor? Why not friend? Mm-hmm. Now, whether that was a Black-white thing or not doesn't matter to me. it's the opposite. So for a bridge building thing for me that's a really good, it's good for him to call me in the carpet on that.
Right.
Now, in my mind, I'm being friendly calling him neighbor, but guess what? I haven't called him neighbor since.
Right.
It's always friend.
Right.
Because I want to be clear where our relationship is. So I think there's a lot of nuance and subtlety and fair pushback to those of you who might say, well, maybe that didn't have anything to do with black-white. Well, what does it hurt to make sure that our nuance can't even be misconstrued in that way? I think there are a lot of subtleties in the way that white people talk to black people, and within the Christian community, hopefully it's getting better or growing in that area. But the example I gave you earlier is the young black man who actually has preached at our church recently, who said, you know what, Gary, it's things like people say to me, hey, you're really articulate for a black man, things like that. So help us understand, and maybe you have a couple other examples of just subtleties that are ultimately racist and that we need to grow in.
I'm colorblind. It's a lie.
Yeah.
It's a lie. No one's colorblind. You know, don't label yourself a racist for seeing me as a black man. Because guess what? I'm a black man.
Yeah.
You know, and when someone tells me they're colorblind, my instant reaction to that is, what are you trying to hide? Or follow up to that, what are you guilty about? What do you feel guilty about to have to say to me when I have not introduced race? You know, in the course of a conversation, you know what? Yeah, man, you know, I understand because my parents raised me to be colorblind. Well, I'm sorry if your parents raised you to be that way, because that's not reality.
Yeah.
Because the reality is when I'm encountered by a stranger, no matter what position that stranger they hold, the context that they view me in, or the lens they view me in, is a lens of a black man. And that's irregardless of position. When I was in the Navy, I had white subordinates, and I know that they saw me as a black man, not as an E5, not as an E6, but as a black man. And the reason why I knew that is because when they would get orders from me, it was different. The response was different versus the response to a white supervisor. You know, like I would tell them to do something. Well, why do I need to do that? One of my white shipmates would tell them the same thing, and there would be no pushback. You know, that's one nuance. You know, one statement that people make at times that you know, black people are offended about. Now, to piggyback on your statement of your the minister that spoke here not long ago, we get a lot of pushback as black people when we mention the term white privilege. And I know a lot of white people are offended by that term because they think, so just let me give a broad definition of that. White privilege does not mean that you were born into money. It does not mean you was born rich. It does not mean that you haven't had to work hard for what you have. What white privilege means is, if given the same start, there is implicit advantages and even explicit advantages that you hold being white that I just don't hold because there's a few reasons for that. Number one, your people have had a 400-year head start over my people. You know, and into that 400 years, built into that 400 years with certain biases that have permeated throughout society that have not been eradicated. And one of the reasons why those have not been eradicated is America as a country has not dealt with slavery in an honest way. We speak more about the Holocaust. There were Holocaust museums in Washington, D.C. before there were Black History museums. What does that tell you about our nation's willingness to really deal with the issues that are at hand? And so So white privilege is not that you didn't have to work for what you have, or that everything was handed to you. You know, I know everybody's not Donald Trump. I know everybody was not given $1 million by his father as they start in life. But what I also know is, I also know that I've had to work harder for many of the same things that my white counterparts did not have to work as hard for, because certain assumptions are baked into being white that are not baked into being black. I give some examples. First example, when I was in high school, when I first got to high school, even though I scored, in the 90 percentiles in almost all the standardized tests that I took, I had a high school counselor still trying to get me to take shop classes versus being in academic classes. And anybody who knows me knows I'm not very good with my hands. And so if I wind up in a vocational program, you are actually setting me up for failure, because you set me up to be in a situation that is not good for me, because it does not speak to my particular skill set. And so the way we were dealt with in school, see, we did not experience racism for the first time when we became adults. This racism is based on the systems that are in place, because there was not a single system in our country, whether it be educational, economic, political, criminal, every institutional system that was put in place in this country was the initial implementation of it had the oppression and degradation of black people as a written rule. It was okay. The very Constitution that we hold so dear, in the original document of that text, black people was only considered 3/5 of a person. So it took 5 people to equal 3 black people. And so that all feeds white privilege. And if I have to give a really stark example as to how a recent example that many people may be able to relate to or may identify, when Barack Obama ran for president for his first term, it was the first time in my life. And when Obama ran the first time was in 2008. And so in 2008, I was 34 years old. In my 34 years, it was the first time I ever heard a news commentator remark about Barack Obama's articulate ability. Because it is assumed that if you make it to the level of being able to gain your party's nomination and run for president, articulation is something that is assumed, because it's assumed that you're intelligent, except for him. In fact, the only time, and I'm not going to name any names because I don't want to disparage anybody, the only times a president's intelligence was ever spoken about was when people thought he wasn't intelligent enough. And like, again, I'm not going to name any presidents, but, or didn't speak well enough. That was the surprise, that this man made it this far, and he really don't talk well. He made it this far, and he really doesn't know this, that, and the other. But in Obama's instance, he had to prove that he was, instead of it being assumed that he was, and that's really white privilege in a nutshell.
So you unpacked a couple things here I want to get into. You talk about 400 years. So one of the pushbacks to 400 years, and you and I had this conversation a couple weeks ago, that I think is really helpful for people. I'm going to articulate this part, and you jump off on it. I think for one of the things you had said to me was, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not looking for you to apologize for slavery as if you've done it. You said something like, I haven't been a slave and you haven't owned slaves. I'm looking for you to, for the country and for white people to recognize that slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights, all the way down, has influenced some worldviews, attitudes, mindsets, and institutions. And so I've heard that several times in the conversations I've been having. The image that's come to my mind is sort of like, we've got roots that go back to that time. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Again, just to reiterate the point that you correctly said that I articulated in our first conversation. It's not, white people don't have to apologize for slavery. Acknowledge that slavery still has an impact on the way, on the states and conditions of people to this day. Because the advantages that were created by that system those advantages are still being reaped to this very day. Just to give a couple examples. So yes, the Emancipation Proclamation happens or whatnot, and so now blacks are literally not slaves anymore. Okay, and so initially, what was created from that was you had a black trade class that, because blacks were the only ones who dealt with, who did that type of labor, and so we had unique skills as a result of being slaves for all those years. And so, what wound up happening was, instead of being slaves now, we're being workers who are earning wages that are not commensurate with the work that we're putting out. And so we went from being free labor to cheap labor. Well, guess what? Cheap labor is not really much better than free labor because you still are being undervalued, and so, and then the other part to that as well is, the value that's being assigned to you is not being assigned by you, it's being assigned to you. And so it's somebody else's interpretation or impression of how valued you are. You're not able to dictate the terms of your value. You're not able to say, I can do this, I can do that. No, what you're being told is, this is what you can do and what you can't do. This is what it's worth. Whereas, white people at the time could go in and they can expect a certain wage from an employer because it was a standard type wage. So that's one thing. And so now you push forward and you push into, Jim Crow. And once again, Jim Crow, it assigned values to us. It assigned certain rights to us, and once again, these advantages have continued. They continue to permeate society, and although we're no longer called slaves, we're still called something. We're not called peers. We're not called colleagues. We're not called friends. For the most part, we're not allowed to live on the same side of town. We're not allowed to go to the same schools. That farce that came out about separate but equal, it was a farce because there's no such thing as separate but equal if you're funding one school and you're not funding the other school. And so, all these different things, they continue to permeate society. And so now, you push it forward a little bit further, and now you got the Jim Crow era, which kind of led to the civil rights movement and whatnot. And so now, we start to get, for the first time in our nation's history, certain rights that have been guaranteed to other folks are finally now starting to be given to us. Now, you notice I said guaranteed to others, but then I said given to us because they're given to us on paper, but they're still not guaranteed. Because even though it's written law that we got the right to vote, you go in to register, you got to count how many jelly beans is in the jar. You got to pay a tax that no one else has to pay. You have to break through all these barriers just to get the right. What does the Constitution say? That all of us have a right to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Where's our liberty? Where's the right to our life? Okay, so again, these are wrestling matches. The only thing I'm pointing out is the wrestling match that has been going on in this country from this country's inception. And then so you move forward and you moved into the era that I was born in. You move into the 70s, and so now you're 10, 15 years into post civil rights and everything else, but you have redlining. And so you have certain neighborhoods, certain cities who have written into their city codes that you can't sell property to a black person, even if that black person can afford the property. And so what does redlining do? Now, redlining, it is a form of segregation. Because you're guaranteeing the certain population based on, how you write your city's documents. Okay, and so now we move forward and we move into the ages that I'm in school and everything else, and then you had the Rodney King incident happen towards the end of my high school life. So I know I kind of took the long road to get here, but what I'm saying is, as you can see, that there has been a wrestling match that has gone on for 400 years, which is why when I say 400 years, it has been 400 years, and there has been progress, but we're far from finished. And those systems that again, one of the reasons why I say 400 years, because these systems that we live under now were starting to be established 400 years ago. And we have not adequately dealt with the inequality that was built into these systems, the assumptions that was built into these systems, the access, the lack of access that was actually built into these systems. And until we adequately deal with that reality, and again, I'll go back to the point that you made that I articulated to you on the telephone conversation. I'm not talking about apology. I'm talking about acknowledgement. And with acknowledgement comes acceptance. And with acceptance, real change can then come. Because as long as, if I don't accept that a problem exists, I'm not going to do anything to try to eradicate that problem.
Huge point.
I'm not going to do anything. It's like your kid come home, with a report card. He got all D's on his report card. Oh, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. Is your son going to get anything better than me for the rest of his scholastic career? Probably not. Because you haven't addressed to him that this is a problem. But no, Junior, no, Gary Junior, this doesn't work. In this house, we get good grades. We're gonna do something. We're gonna solve this issue. Now, okay, you know what? That brought something else in my mind. If your son is in 9th grade getting D's, he didn't just start getting D's. This happened. You would have noticed certain things about your son back when he was in preschool and in kindergarten and early on. And so if you're a good parent, what you're going to do is you're going to notice that there's something going on there, and you're going to try to solve the problem as early as possible so that now when he gets to high school, these things have been identified and have been dealt with. So with this country, we have never dealt with the issues. And so they have festered. And just like your son, you can't expect your son to get good grades if you start addressing things in the 9th grade. You can't expect us to be on an equal playing field if for 400 years you have failed to acknowledge that we've never been on an equal playing field.
So that brings in, if you're hanging with us, let me encourage you to, after that history, and as we get into these next topics, let me just give you a spoiler alert. Like, we know and we believe that a huge part of the answer here isn't political, isn't even legislative, but is what comes about by being believers in Jesus and the common citizenship we have, and then what the responsibility of the church is. The church can make a huge difference here. So you listen to all that you just said, and you just go, it's like despair, right? So I want to talk about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter for a minute. George Floyd, and I think you'd agree with this, even just something you posted earlier that I watched it, was much less a martyr than he was a catalyst, right? Certainly that was the effect of watching, and I didn't watch the entire video. I watched an edited version. That was enough for me. I was in the woods by myself. Anyway, I recounted, or in the midst of all this, I don't remember on the timeline, but I sat down for dinner with my family, and we started to talk about all this. And I broke down talking about George Floyd calling for his mom, right? And let me just say on the record here, I don't really care what George Floyd did or what he had in his system. I think part of the issue with police brutality, and I think you can make a fair point to some degree that police brutality is an issue and racial profiling is an issue, and that they overlap at times. But the issue for me is that there's due process. And so not having read the facts on Floyd's background and so on and so forth, due process is a huge part of the issue for me. But as I broke down, my youngest son, whose best friend is Black, he just kind of on his own, he said, Dad, I know what white privilege is, because the things that my friend tells me, the way that people look at him different, the things that he has to think about, the way he lives life, those things don't even enter into my thinking. And he's like 14 years old. And by the way, side point, the young people that are driving a lot of this dialogue and a lot of the movement, if we lose the opportunity to see these young people who have passion and drive come to Christ, we're missing a huge, because it's an amazing generation in their willingness to speak out. So that brings me to, do you want to respond to that before I get into the Black Lives Matter part?
Yeah, just like one one quick interjection in terms of the church.
Yeah.
If we don't embrace the passion and the activism that exists in our children's generation, they will leave the church.
Yeah, amen.
They will leave the church.
Yeah, please hear that.
They will leave the church.
Yeah.
Because they will not see a church. They will not see the church as a representation of who they are.
Yeah.
And what do we always say in church? That we say that, we take communion. Now, we're not eating Jesus' flesh. We're not drinking his blood. Mm. We say this is a representation of his body. Mm. This is a representation of his blood. Mm. It is infused. Representation is infused in Christianity. Mm. It is a faith of representation. Jesus represented us by going to the cross. Mm-hmm. Now he advocates for us at the right hand of his Father. It's representative. And so if the church doesn't represent or reflect the views of our young people, they will leave the church. Yeah. And so that's what I, because I know where you're going. So that's just what I wanted to interject.
Yeah, well, maybe we come to the Black Lives Matter conversation later. Then maybe we jump. It's a jumping off point because I think there's a tremendous, and I said this this past weekend in our baptism service. This is a tremendous opportunity here. And I really wanted Luther to have, I know this is long, and I'm just encouraging you to bear with us. I wanted him to have platform here because I think it's really important that being the white church, and we're going to start to talk about the fact that we're a homogenous church in a minute, but being the white church, it's really important that we listen, that we be a listening friend. Mm-hmm. And yes, dialogue is a part of that. But to your point, not having a sort of formed response before we get to the end of it. But as we talk about, now we're kind of stepping aside from just being a black man and a white man who are friends. Now we start to talk about being two guys who have been redeemed and regenerated by the saving work of Jesus on the cross. That changes the dynamics altogether. And so there's two things that you and I have. One that everybody has, and one that not everybody does. The one thing is there's a misnomer in the idea of talking about our different races, right? Genetically, we are 99% and plus genetically the same. We are of the same race. We are the human race. And the genetic difference is in ethnic expression. So we already have commonality at the highest. We have so much in common. And that tiny percentage point that's different is what we spend all this time, to your point about the history of our country, putting each other in different categories. And historically, whites doing that where it concerns blacks. And, I've told the story, and I don't want to wax too long here on this, but I've told the story about growing up here at GBC, doing these joint baptism services with St. John's Christian Church, when they were mostly a black gospel church, and we were even far more, primarily white than we even are now. We're more diverse now than we were then. And how driving away from those events, which were about, I think, twice a year or so as a kid, my father saying, and I already having these feelings, this is what heaven's going to be like. So the ethnic expression within our one human race is a huge point of it is his glory expressed in his creation. And like everything in life that gets tainted by sin, we take something he intended to be beautiful and we corrupt it and we make it ultimately evil, and we sin against each other in the midst of that. So in terms of our humanity, right, everybody has that. You don't have to be a Christian to have that in common. But the blood of Jesus, and we've looked at the passages over the last couple of weeks, right? Ephesians 2, there's the dividing walls removed. There's no longer hostility. And you could make the argument that even cultural, racial, and religious hostility between Samaritans and Jews may have been even more awful than black-white racism in the United States. But whether you agree with that or not, point is, there's no division. But we don't live and act as if there's no division. Mm-hmm. And that includes the church. One of the things that I've become convicted of in this whole season is the church has had several opportunities in the history that Luther described, to step out and stand out and say something, and they shrunk from that. So George Floyd brings us it's a catalyst to a nexus point where we can stand up and say, what happened to George Floyd is wrong, and it represents something that's wrong with our society and culture. And when we start to look, that goes all the way back, let's acknowledge it and start to have these dialogues. Then the church gets to step into this position and have a unique ability, because we are already one in Christ, to say, man, we can get out front of the culture on this and model what brotherhood looks like. And certainly sisterhood too, because, you know, there's only 2 guys here at this time. But anyway, that's a lot. Wasn't as long as you talked.
No,
but,
no. I am very verbose. I don't think you're going to ever have a segment of this conversation that's going to be longer than mine.
So, yeah. So react to some of that.
So, in my lifetime, and I believe I would be accurate in saying in the lifetime of this country, what the church, outside of the civil rights movement, because the white church really did infuse itself into the civil rights movement. One of the turning points of the civil rights movement was a letter from the Birmingham jail. And what Dr. King's, no, let me stop. As Christians, we should never refer to MLK as Dr. King. He should always be referred to as Reverend.
Here.
You know, because I think what has happened as time has gone on, he has become too secular.
Yes.
As a leader.
Huge.
And so what has then what him becoming secularized has done, it has in many ways diminished his standing in the white church. Because the white church doesn't see him as a spiritual leader. They see him as a
civil rights leader. Yeah.
As a civil rights leader.
Yeah.
So, you know, as a church family, we need to acknowledge that this man was a reverend.
Amen.
And his northern counterparts, that's how they saw him. And so the letter from the Birmingham jail challenged the white pastors up north, because he knew he wasn't going to get any help from the white pastors in the south. And so it challenged the white pastors of the north to come down and join in on the movement. And one of the great martyrs, his name escapes me right now, but one of the great martyrs of the civil rights movement was in fact a white student activist who came down to Alabama from Massachusetts and joined the movement. Okay, so outside of that, you know, I'm going to make that point of distinction, because if I didn't make it, I wouldn't be historically correct. But for the vast majority of our history, there has been when these incidents have happened. Now, I can't speak, you know, totally intelligently, but I'm making some assumptions here. I just you know, put out that disclaimer. But what I felt like has happened in the white church when these things happen is, I believe there is some reflection and some reflection, but not any action. And for the first time in my life, I'm seeing action. But to the point you made earlier, the action I'm seeing is of young Christians, not the Christians of my generation and older. And this is a harsh truth. It was a harsh truth for me to come to terms with years ago, but it's a harsh truth I had to come to terms with years ago, back into my teens, when I really, you know, studied history. The tough truth is, white Christians were slave owners. You know, probably the entirety, if not the entirety, at least 97% were slave owners, resisted abolition, instituted Jim Crow, started the Ku Klux Klan, resisted the civil rights movement, and now elected Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump is a symbol for me. And let me tell you why, because I don't want to make this, because this is not political. As Gary said earlier, this is not political. But the symbol that Donald Trump represents for so many black people that made him an abhorrent, you know, candidate for us was, first of all, he tried to delegitimize the first black president of the United States with that birther movement. That hurt us. That hurt us. And one of the issues that I have with a lot of my white Christian brothers and sisters is when I tell them that, they act as if that's not a big deal. But guess what? It's a big deal because we celebrated this black man becoming the president of the United States. And right after him, you elect the man that tried to delegitimize him and tried to say he wasn't even a citizen. The first president, the only president in this nation's history that had to show his birth certificate was the first black president of the United States, and that hurt. And then to couple that with the fact that this guy ran on a slogan, "Make America Great Again," when was America ever great for black folks? That's painful. That people in 2016 would be nostalgic about an America that enslaved, that oppressed, that lynched, that had dogs sick on them, that got hosed down. Not even a full 2 generations ago, that there's a segment of America that will be nostalgic about that America. It's painful. And so back to your question, what we have to do as a church is we have to acknowledge and accept that we have dropped the ball as a church. Because face it, the most segregated day of the week is Sunday. We may have white friends, as a black man, I have white friends, I have white coworkers, I ride the bus with white people, but when I go to church, there aren't that many white people. And then the same thing about white people. Black coworkers, black neighbors, black people in every circle of our lives except for church. So I know again, I went down a very windy road.
Yeah, and let me jump on. I want to respond to the Donald Trump thing because I think it's important for people to hear this. You might not. Let's say you voted for Donald Trump and you didn't vote for him for any of those reasons. I want to remind us we're here to listen to how that felt and what that experience was for him. For whatever reason that you may have voted and or continue to support. Noting that those elements that Luther talked about, what that communicated to the black community, and you can hear the passion in his voice, what it says to him personally. So let me encourage you and me. We're in a listening mode here. The response, the catalyst that George Floyd's death has been to shut up and listen. So you can grind out the politics on the other side in your own thinking. This is not a two-way conversation right now, other than between the two of us. So thank you for sharing that. That's helpful for us to know that perspective. And so I want to get into the Black Lives Matter thing this morning, or this afternoon, and then move toward, maybe we can reach some sort of conclusion here. Because again, there is hope. But I've been really careful in my conversations with my black friends, and even some of my Hispanic friends, to not rush to, I'm an optimist, right? I'm a creative problem solver. I love teamwork. So I can start to get excited about the hope, but we need to hang in kind of the woe for a little bit, listen well and not rush to that. But we are going to get there. But I will tell you straight up, and I don't know if we've had this conversation, that I have problems with the Black Lives Matter from an organizational standpoint. And some of the things that they've said, people that they've put out front, so on and so forth. But I have moved away from, and you've helped me with this, and correct me if I'm wrong, or help us understand, saying and or supporting the idea of Black Lives Matter should be something that we're all willing to do. And if you can give us the philosophy behind that, because it's been really helpful. Whereas organizationally, you can say, just like other organizations, you might say, I like the idea of what this started as, but I don't support what they're doing now. So can you unpack some of that and help us?
Yeah, so Black Lives Matter started, and this shouldn't surprise anybody with the way the world is now, started doing a Facebook conversation. Huh. And so when Trayvon Martin was killed down in Florida for going, and all he had done, the only thing he was guilty of was going to the store to get his brother some Skittles. On his way back, because he was black and wearing a hoodie, George Zimmerman perceived him as being dangerous. White kids wear hoodies all the time are not assumed dangerous. But because Trayvon Martin was a black kid wearing a hoodie, he was considered dangerous. His dad lived there. He had every right to be there as anybody else. So fast forward a little bit. So he gets killed, and two ladies on Facebook are having this conversation, and one of the ladies on Facebook says, don't Black Lives Matter? So that's where the whole Black Lives Matter after that, because you know how everything goes in today's society, a hashtag was formed.
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter. And so that's the etymology, that is where the movement and the hashtag emanated from. And then, you can see all that has happened since Black Lives Matter became a hashtag. The killings haven't stopped. And the one thing that we say, a lot as a people, is they haven't increased, just they're being filmed. And so they're being, now the only thing that has increased is the proliferation into society. But we've been screaming, out from the wilderness, for a very long time, that this is what has been going on. This is what has been transpiring. One thing I think about, and I'll get right back to Black Lives Matter. I think if there hadn't been a recording, would someone have believed a bystander that said Officer Chauvin had his knee on the neck of George Floyd for almost 9 minutes? Probably not. So I digress for a minute. But now getting back to Black Lives Matter. And so this hashtag, was created about Black Lives Matter, and instantly, my white friends started to say, all lives matter. So I would tell them, look, we're not saying Black Lives Matter more than all lives. What we're saying is Black Lives Matter as much as all lives. Because again, going back to the history that I went through some minutes ago, at the start of this country, we were only considered 3/5 of a person. And so the devaluing of Black life was actually written into the American psyche. And so what we're saying in terms of Black Lives Matter is my life matters just as much as your life. And you need to start acting like, and your actions need to start to show that you believe my life matters as much as yours. And so when I hear one of my white friends come back at me and say, all lives matter, the first thing that comes to my mind after being offended is, you don't get it. And then when I hear a supporter of the police say, blue lives matter, the first response to me after being offended is, you don't get it. When I hear somebody who supports the military saying green lives matter, it's amazing to me how prior to the Black Lives Matter hashtag, there was no blue lives matter. There was no all lives matter. There was no green lives matter. There was only there was none of that. But now we try to take ownership, and we try to take pride in ourselves, and we try to show the country that we value our lives. And all of a sudden there has to be these responses that, well, all lives matter. That's not what I'm saying. Yeah. Again, I'm reiterating this point. I'm saying this point multiple times because I need for, good meaning, white people to understand that we're not disparaging you when we say Black Lives Matter. We're affirming that our lives matter as much as your life. Yeah. Please get that. Black lives matter as much as white lives, as much as Asian lives, as much as any life, any other adjective you want to put in front of the lives that you want to put in front of. Our lives matters just as much as those lives do. And that's what Black Lives Matter is really all about. Now, with any movement, you're going to have areas of that movement that you are against. If you are, just for a moment, No, I don't have to go there for a moment. I was about to go into some political stuff for a moment. I don't have to go into that. I'm sure there are members of Brighton Bible Chapel who love Brighton Bible Chapel. There are probably elements of Brighton Bible Chapel that they would rather improve. There's nothing wrong with wanting change or with not liking a certain. Just because you don't like a friend's element of something of a movement, don't mean that you should denounce the whole movement. Mm-hmm. Because the whole movement on its face is, again, black people telling everybody else in this country that our lives matter as much as every other life. Mm-hmm. Because if you come to that acknowledgement, then you'll be just as offended as I am that Sister Tiana was in her house. A no-knock warrant was issued. They were at the wrong house. They busted into her house and she was shot in her own home. You would be just as outraged about that as I am. If black lives, if you believe that black lives matter, then it wouldn't have taken George Floyd to have a knee on his neck for the outrage to start. If you really believe, when Black Lives Matter, means something to you, and when you acknowledge that our lives matter as much as everybody else's, when you hear about Aubrey, taking a jog down in Georgia and being shot for taking a jog down in Georgia, you'd be just as outraged as I was. You would do more than say, "Oh, that was awful." Mm-hmm. No, there would be outrage. Mm-hmm. Because you would see not a black man getting killed, but you would see a man going for a jog getting killed. Mm-hmm. And that sums it up in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's maybe the wake-up call here. I think, for those that are listening, that one of the things that's been, I think there are a lot of things that this could spin off into, right? Like I had some friends out west who are involved with the Navajo Nation, right? Talking about the native population and how disadvantaged they are, how COVID is going crazy. And do Navajo lives matter? Yes. Right now, what's being brought to the forefront of society. So here's my point. It's very easy to divert to these other things. Now, as a church, we're actually involved in the Navajo Nation with Pastor Chi, and so there's a lot going on there. Again, I think it's one of the huge disappointments is how fast this has become politicized. And as I said this past weekend, that now when you speak out, you're nervous to speak out because you're going to get shoved in a category. You got to push past that. And what's been helpful for me is to take it away from the pundits and the Facebook posts and to talk with my friend and to hear his heart. And I can't dismiss or dispel what you just heard him say and what it feels like to be a black man in America in 2020. And it shouldn't be that way. And even when my sons and I did the 2.23 or whatever mile run for Ahmaud Arbery, and it's wrong that it feels like, should I be doing this, right? Should I be stepping out and standing up? Like, as Christians, because of everything you already said about the human race and the blood of Christ, when something is wrong and someone is mistreated, I don't care if they're purple, like, we should be speaking out. And so in this particular case, this is focused around something that happened. I mean, you're right. It's a shame on us that took the catalyst of George Floyd. But here we are. So what are we going to do about it? So as a leadership in our church, and the elders, as we're wrestling through this, there's some personal conviction and repentance relative to apathy and just sort of a sitting on our hands kind of thing. But then we're immediately thinking, okay, what can we do so that the gospel of Jesus Christ is made clear, is preached in this church, and that we are honoring the body of Christ in the diversity that we do have within the context of our church. And then as we do that, that models, right, the commonality that we have as humans and in the body of Christ for the rest of the world, and gives us further audience. As we sort of move toward a conclusion here, Luther, what would you say specifically to somebody in my position and or congregants who sit in this church? How can we make a difference? How can we push back sort of the gut instinct to become political about this and just use this as a point of ministry and use this as a point of sort of gospel healing in first the church, because I think it starts in our churches, and then the country. Like, what can we do? What does the Black community say? Man, if my white friends would do this, it would start to make a difference.
Well, I we can really, I believe in churches all over America. One of the things that has to start to happen, and I think this would be something that would resonate with you very well, being a youth pastor prior to being a senior pastor, is we have to start to listen to our youth. The Bible says the child shall lead them. How many of us can honestly say that our children have led us anywhere? And so under that model of youth and children leadership, they're setting a great example as to what all of us should be doing. And I say that to undergird the point that I'm getting ready to make now. Being a true ally, which means be willing to set aside some comfort, to rally alongside those who have been oppressed. We're Christians, right? Didn't Jesus give up a very comfortable perch to come down here to die for us? The most comfortable perch that has ever existed. Heaven.
You're here.
He gave up the heavenly perch to take on flesh, to then die for us as a sacrifice so that we can have the right to the tree of life. If he was willing to do that for us, then if we're, Christ is a model. So now we must be willing to get uncomfortable for our fellow man. Because let me tell you something, and this is one thing that I haven't said as often as I've said some other things that I've said, but this conversation is uncomfortable for me because I've been defining racism my entire life. When I was in school as the only black kid in history class, anytime slavery was talked about or anytime the civil rights movement was talked about, everybody in class would turn around and look at me as if I was the resident expert on racism, on slavery, on civil rights. And so I'm tired of having this conversation, but for the sake of healing, for the sake of helping my brother, rise up and ascend into a better place, I'm having this conversation, even though it is uncomfortable. I know this is uncomfortable for you as well.
Sure is.
So, like I said, the main thing is all of us have to be willing to step out of comfort and become uncomfortable for change.
Yeah.
Because the church is an agent of change, supposedly, but in all actuality, for so many years, rather than change the world, we've conformed to the world, which goes against directly scripture that we say, that we use to try to get people saved.
Yeah.
Be ye not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind.
He goes King James too.
Yes, we use that to exhort people into salvation, but yet the body of Christ has conformed more than it has changed. We are to be transformational, not conformative.
Yeah.
And so we have to, I plead to all of my fellow white Christians, to all of my white Christian brothers and sisters, step out of your comfort zone. Follow the lead of your pastor. Be willing to get uncomfortable. Missionaries, they go to the Amazon jungle to try to win converts. They go to all these different uncomfortable places. Why is it that we are willing to go to uncomfortable places outside of our nation, but we're not willing to be uncomfortable in our own nation to save our own citizens? I applaud missionary work. Missionary work is a necessity for the spread of the gospel. But we have to become missionaries. We have to become domestic missionaries. Stop looking so much to save the world, because our nation needs to be saved. Amen. Jesus went to his own received him not, but that's where he went first. We need to to take care of home.
I love that you brought us back to the gospel, because that's where, for me, that's the only, I can spend all this time on YouTube trying to, absorb, your recounting the history has been really helpful, but, like just absorbing and listening, and all that does is, I texted you the other day, right? It's confusing, but I mean, it's so funny you mentioned comfort, because we talked about it as elders the other day. Like, we sort of default and press toward, okay, let's get back to where we're coming, even with COVID, right? Get back to when it's comfortable. Don't we understand, like, God has foreordained, providentially allowed this season clearly for our discomfort for some reason. COVID first, and now bringing up this, festering wound, if you want to consider it that way, for us. I was talking to a brother yesterday who goes to this church, and he said, he said, I will know that there's real change happening, actual change, when the protests and the rallies don't all contain people who look like me. And I think there's some movement in that direction, but he makes a huge point, and that's a very convicting point, because the gospel is something that is not passive. I mean, you talked about communion, you talked about Christ coming from the throne of heaven, which you had no way of knowing. I talked about this past weekend in our baptism service, and giving all that up for us. Just huge points. Brother, I love you.
And he flipped over tables when he wasn't happy with what was going on. It's time for us to start flipping over some tables. So. Yeah.
Listen, I love you.
Love you too, my man.
I appreciate, you're right. I mean, it's clunky for both of us, but, I can't even imagine if people don't have a friendship that exists for a long time to be able to have this conversation. But my only encouragement to you, a little bit added on to what Luther said, and you can disagree with me if you want, I don't think you will. I think if you have somebody in your neighborhood that maybe you haven't met, not for the sake of, like Luther said, hey, I need to get your resident expertise on this area, but just to get to know them as a human being. We had lived in our neighborhood a couple of years ago. We knew our neighbors immediately behind us that I talked about earlier. There's a man who lives kind of around the corner down the street, dark black man, and hadn't had a chance to meet him. So I walked across the street one night. He was out in his yard, and we just got to talking, and he had a very thick African accent. And he's got a bunch of kids and grandkids that come and go. And so my kids were my daughter especially, hanging out with his little girls and stuff. And so we just started having a conversation and getting his story. And it turns out he was moved here during the Rwandan genocide. Had been in an apartment in East Lyme and then moved to this home. And, just getting to know his story, becoming friends with this man in my neighborhood. And then, I think for me, as I've been thinking about this, relative to what I just said about reaching out to somebody in your neighborhood who's, just different than you, I've thought to myself, I've had a couple conversations with him, I've gotten to know him, but we need to break bread together, and so getting out of your comfort zone is a really good thing. That doesn't mean it's always fun, but I think that's where, that's everything that you said. It really comes back to the gospel and what God can do when we're willing to take a risk and to stand up. So anyway, last word is yours.
I would just make one quick statement. First, I just want to affirm what you just said. If you have not just, and I'm even, add to it a little bit. Any neighbor that is in your neighborhood that you haven't met yet.
Great point.
Extend. Because if I'm your black neighbor and I've noticed that I'm the only neighbor you have come to, and I haven't seen you knock on anybody else's door, then that's gonna make me wonder. Why is this my door? You know what I mean? And so that's we want to be equal. And so if you knock on my door, knock on his door too. Knock on that door as well. And then, the last thing is, and just to inject a little brevity into this situation that's been full of, everything else. Gary texted me this morning And he, or was it last night? I forget, because these days are running together with COVID. I'm working from home and all this other stuff. But he texted me. He said, look forward to, it was last night. He said, look forward to seeing you, my brother. I just wish it was under more fun conditions. And my reply to you was, we got the rest of our lives to have fun. The time for this conversation is now.
Amen.
And this conversation is a start, but it's a great start. And we have to take advantage of the momentum that conversations like these can create, because this is not an isolated incident. We're not the only two, co-laborers in the gospel that are having this conversation.
Ours might be the longest.
It might be the longest. Definitely longer than John Gray and his boy. But yeah, so we just have to take advantage of the momentum that is being generated throughout this moment. We don't want to look back on this 10 years from now and say that, man, we had a chance.
Yeah.
And we didn't do it. You know what I mean? Because policy does need to change, but the heart needs to change first. Policy will never change without a change in the heart.
Amen.
And that's what Christ endeavored to do more than anything else.
Amen.
So,
on that note, will you lead us in prayer?
Yes. So, Father God, we just want to first say thank you. We say thank you for the sacrifice that you gave us so many centuries ago. The sacrifice of your Son. Jesus, we thank you for counting not robbery to leave your perch in heaven, to come down here to set an example for us on how to live on this earth. And Jesus, in that example, you dealt with all people. In fact, if we really look at your life, we can honestly say that your primary reaching out was to those who have been rejected, those who had been left out, those who was least thought of. So Lord, in that endeavor, as we model our lives after the life that you live, which is what all of us say we endeavor to do, allow us to really live up to that precept. Allow us to really live up to that notion. Allow us to be the very examples, the very ambassadors of your love, of the grace, and of your peace. Because God loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believed in him will not perish but have everlasting life. Amen. It was first love, then it was grace, then it was salvation. Lord, let us not skip the love or the grace and go straight to salvation. Let us first love one another. Let us also give each other grace. Let us forgive one another for their faults, and forgive one another of anything they have done against us, any transgression against us. Because it's only after the love and the grace can true salvation be had. And Lord, so as we go throughout this moment, let us not just be hearers, but let us be doers of the word also. Let us not just be speakers, but let us also be listeners. But most of all, Lord, let us be the example that you have called us out to be. Because what you told your disciples today, so many years ago, before you left this earth, is still true today. Greater things will we be able to do because your spirit lives in us. Let us begin to do those greater things. It is for your sake, not for our own glory, but for your glory, that we pray this prayer and that we set on this endeavor. It is your name we pray. Amen. Love you, my brother.
Love you too. Don't judge our COVID hug.